Today we're going to talk about customer segments. Who are you building your value proposition for? What jobs do they want to get done? What pains do they want to solve and what gains do they want to see? And at the end of this, what you want to find is what's the archetype or persona of who you're building the product for. Now, last time we talked about value propositions, but today we're going to focus on customer segments. One of the interesting things about customers is that customers don't exist to buy, you actually exist for them. And especially if you're a technology startup, that's really hard because you always think it's about your product. And it's hard to remember that it's actually about the people on the other side who are going to buy. And so one of the things you really need to understand is who are they and why are they going to buy from you? And one of the goals of customer segments is trying to understand the archetype or the persona or maybe just the details of who these people are in specific detail. You want to know where they live, what do they do, what's their age, are they in urban areas or are they married, etc. And why do you want to know that? Because it will help you figure out how to not try to boil the ocean by trying to get everybody in the world to buy your product, but figuring out who specifically is interested and why makes it incredibly easy to sell and have them want your product when you understand who they are and what their motivations are. So that's why we spend all this time talking about customers and customer segments. One of the things you'll also see later in this lecture is that you might actually have multiple customer segments. That is, different types of customers all interested in your product. They might be male, 18 through 24, live in urban areas, but you might also have women who live in the countryside, 45 to 55 in some cases, also interested. And the types of marketing or demand creation you'll do to attract each segment will be different. But if you didn't know who they were, you'd be creating the same type of marketing and, in fact, probably not reaching any of them. So let's take a look at this in more detail. So if you remember from the last lecture, value propositions, what we're really trying to do is find the right product market fit between what you're building and who wants to buy it. Again, we call this relationship between value proposition and customer segment simply product market fit. Today in customer segments, in this lecture, we're really going to ask what job are we getting done for the customer? That is, what functional or social jobs are we going to get done? What emotional jobs? What problems or needs are we solving? What gains are we providing the customer? What pains? How does market type affect this? And at the end, what we're going to come up with is a deep understanding of the persona and archetype. Who are they? Why would they buy? Why won't they buy? What do you need to say to them? And if you spend your energy out of the building doing customer development and customer discovery here, it will make your company incredibly efficient in actually figuring out how to market and sell to them. So remember, the goal is now to connect the value proposition with what you're going to know and learn outside the building about customers. Now, remember, your goal here is to start with a series of hypotheses. That's all you have on day one. If you're a domain expert, maybe you know a little more, but it's okay because you're just kind of guessing here. You start with, well, here's who I think my customers are. But then you get out of the building and you start running experiments and you find out, oh, I was right. Or more often, on your first guess is, I was wrong. And because we're going to do these experiments cheaply, inexpensively, and up front, we're going to save all the enormous waste we would do if we waited until we launched the product and did an expensive marketing campaign, and then only then realizing that, oops, these weren't our customers, or these were our customers, but we built the wrong features. So let's dive down a level deeper and first focus on what's the jobs needed to be done. That is, what's the customer segment trying to get done, and is it a problem or need? Now, this phrase jobs to be done was first popularized by Clayton Christensen, who wrote a series of books, The Innovator's Dilemma and The Innovator's Solution. Should probably be on any entrepreneur's reading list. And what Christensen said is, look, what functional or social jobs are getting done? That is, does the customer want to perform or complete a specific task, or solve a problem, or trying to look good, gain power or status? Or are there some emotional jobs? Do they want to look better, feel good, feel more secure? And what basic needs are you helping your customer satisfy?
Is it entertainment? Is it dating? Is it something hardwired into the human psyche? Now, a simple way for you to start with your customer segment hypotheses is rank each job according to what you believe is its significance to the customer. And you get to guess on day one, is it crucial or trivial? And take a guess about how frequently it occurs. And outline what specific context a job gets done. I call this the day in the life of a customer. That is, you ultimately ought to be able to go up to a whiteboard and diagram, for me or anybody else, here's what a customer does from the moment they get up to when they go to work or when they're at school or something else, and here are the products they use and the car they drive and what they read, etc. And if you really don't have a deep understanding of that customer and where your product fits, you're really going to have a hard time understanding them. Now, just remember, on day one, all you're mostly doing is guessing. But the whole objective of getting out of the building is trying to fill in this day in the life. So you actually, when you say something about, here's how we ought to go advertise to them or reach them or use Google AdWords to them, that you're just not saying, it's because I think so. It's because you're saying, I've spoken to a ton of these people and they'd love to buy our stuff, but here's how we reach them, or here's the key message we need to deliver. So another key component of understanding customers is understanding customer gains, which is a fancy way for saying what are the benefits the customers expect or desires. So besides the jobs they want to get done, what do they want to gain by using your product or service? So let's take a look. So some of the gains could be, what would make them happy? Is it saving money, saving effort, saving time? And what do they expect? And what would go beyond their expectations? How would you delight these customers? Is it quality, more of something, less of something? And is it features that would delight them, or performance, or quality? And what would make your customer's job or life easier? More services, lower cost of ownership, flatter learning curve? Obviously, this depends about whether you're selling to business customers or consumer customers, but you want to be able to make a list or a column of all the gains that they would get by using your product. And some more gains could be, is it social consequences? Does it make them look good? Increase in power? Is it good design? Is it specific or more features? And how do they measure success and failure? Is it performance or cost? And what would increase their likelihood of adopting your product or using it or using your solution? Again, is it about cost? Is it about lower risk? Is it about better quality? Is it because it's more fun? You need to come up with a series of hypotheses. Just make that list now. But you can't guess forever. You have to validate these hypotheses. Now, the last piece in understanding customer segments is understanding their pains. We've been talking about all the wonderful stuff that we could do for them that makes them happy. But are there things that we could get rid of that actually is kind of like they've been walking around with an arrow through their head and they've just kind of accepted that for a while, but when you come about, you could say, hey, we could solve these problems for you. Well, let's see what kind of problems we could solve. Is there something your customers find too costly? Again, is it about time and cost too much? This is essentially the flip version of the gains. The pains are, what could we solve for these customers that they hate? Is there something about their product or service that's underperforming? It's missing features, it's too slow, it doesn't work well, it's buggy. And what are the main difficulties and challenges? Now, one of the interesting things is that entrepreneurs come back and say, yes, customers said this was a real pain. Our product really solves these problems. Well, one of the things you need to know is, was this like problem number 47 on their list? Or is this in the top 3? Because most human beings, whether they're in corporations or even at home, tend to only worry about the top 3 or 5. So when you find out that this solves a pain, the question you need to ask is in context, well, what are the other pains you have? And you really want to understand their top 10, top 20, and then if to find out your number 32 or 47, I wouldn't be celebrating, but I actually would be asking, well, wait a minute. Is there any way that our product or service could actually solve anything in the top 5? And if not, maybe you're in the wrong customer segment. And so you want to understand what's keeping your customer awake at night, Or maybe conversely, maybe you want to keep them awake at night, but you want to figure out what are their big issues, concerns, and worries. And then finally, the last piece is, what are the barriers to adopt your product? Is it costs too much up front? So maybe you have a pricing issue to decide later. Gee, it takes a long time to learn. Or, we're happy with what we have and it's kind of okay. And what makes your customers feel bad? Frustrations, annoyances, etc. And what do they fear? Financial or social risks, what could go wrong, etc. You need to understand all of this. And the goal of all this is to actually define the customer persona or archetype, which is just a fancy way for saying, I want you to know everything about those customers. So what could be everything? So at the end of the day, not only do you know about the pains and gains of these customers, but you specifically know who they are. If they're in a company, their position and title, their age, their sex, their role, and consumers could be parent, it could be child. For a consumer, it could be housemate, etc. How do they buy? Where do they buy? How much money do they have, discretionary to spend? And again, it's true in companies, and it's true for consumers. In companies, do you know how much each individual department can sign up for? That is, if you've priced your product $1 too high, sometimes it requires the next level of management to sign off. Same at home. If you're trying to sell to kids, do you know what their allowances are and where they get their money and how often they get it? And if you're selling to consumers who are parents, what's their weekly spend on discretionary items? You need to understand what matters to them, what motivates them, who influences them. And this one isn't trivial. The influences them, you're going to go back to this when you do customer relationships later. And it'd be great if you actually knew how to reach these people and what buttons to push when you do. And so if you start asking these questions when you're starting to talk to them, trying to define them, it makes spending for marketing and demand creation, that is for customer acquisition and activation, incredibly easy because you already asked them up front, how would I get you to buy this? So marketing doesn't become some mysterious process later on. Customers already told you, oh, this is how I buy, and this is how much I spend, and here's who I listen to when I want to make a purchase. As I said earlier, to me the goal is actually for you to know enough to confidently go up to a whiteboard and draw the day in the life of a customer. There's some other things to consider in customer segments besides jobs to be done and pain and gain, and that is, who's the customer? I thought we just defined the customer. It's the archetype, it's the persona. But sometimes who's the customer in context is really what we need to know. In corporations, it's pretty easy to understand that you might have someone who uses the product, but they might not be the person who pays for the product. So there might be someone up here, the payer, let's give them a fancy name and call them the economic buyer. So we might be buying software for accounting to use, but it might be the chief financial officer who has to sign off for that. And in between this process, in a large company, you might have people who influence the decisions. You might have people who actually recommend who the vendors should be. You might have a decision maker who's the head of the department, but still needs to pass off the final purchase to the chief financial officer. And surprisingly, if you spend enough time selling to companies, you might have saboteurs. And saboteurs in a company are individuals or organizations whose jobs feel threatened if a new piece of software or new process or new organization comes in place. And so in complicated business-to-business sales, you really need to know the archetypes for each one of these, even though you might think, oh, all I need to know is about my user. And then you might go, okay, well then all we need to know is about the buyer. As we'll see later, you actually need to understand archetypes for all. Now, if you were kind of rolling your eyes going, well, I don't sell to businesses, I just sell to consumers, this isn't relevant to me, I want you to think of the case of selling entertainment software to teens. Well, think about it. You kind of say, well, the user, well, that's pretty simple. That's the teen. How hard can that be? Well, if they don't have a job, the economic buyer are their parents. And the influencers and recommenders may be their friends. And the decision maker, depending on your family, might be mom or dad or the kid or somebody else in between. And so when we think about business to consumer sales, you also need to start thinking about, is the user different than the payer?
The last example is a personal one. I was buying a car, and I thought, how simple could that be? I was the customer. Little did I know, having two teenage daughters, that really wasn't the case. Because when I started talking about my car, or a potential car, my daughter said, "Dad, you can't buy that type of car. We wouldn't be caught dead in it." And I looked at them and said, "Well, the car's not for you." They said, "Oh, we just won't even be riding in it." And they said, "Well, listen, if you buy that car, you can't get that color." And this conversation went on for a long time until finally we were able to make a decision. And I realized that the final decision maker in our household was my wife.
So for this quiz, let's consider an example where you were selling business intelligence software into an enterprise customer, a large business. Why don't you match the titles below with the roles of the customers? So here's the answer. The chief financial officer is more than likely the economic buyer. The saboteur might actually be the existing business intelligence group inside of IT or the CIO's department who's actually trying to already build the software, and they might be afraid they're going to lose their jobs. So in every major organization, you might find people who actually don't want or actively attempt to block a sale. The CIO is more than likely the decision maker. In some organizations, they can actually sign off on large deals, but in this case, the chief information officer was actually going to recommend to the chief financial officer that they buy this software. The report users, the people who actually use the product, in this case are just simply the influencers. And that's kind of interesting to remember because sometimes as entrepreneurs we forget that the people who use our product are not necessarily the people who even pay for or even recommend the product. And in this case, the recommenders were probably the line of business management. That is, those users worked for a line of business, a division or a department, and the influencers, the people who used it, said to their bosses, "We'd really like to have this software. This would work great." And their managers, who didn't have any signature authority or couldn't actually install software, recommended that this actually get bought. Understanding this ecosystem is really important, not only in business-to-business sales, but sometimes business-to-consumer sales as well. Remember, we've been talking about pass-fail signals and experiments. So as you get out of the building and start talking to these potential customers, you need to set up some experiments. How do I know these are the right customers or the right buyers? And so you want to set up a series of experiments to test interest and figure out where do you want to test it and what kind of experiments can you run and how many do you test. By the way, the how many is a classic question, and the answer is it depends. In a business-to-business enterprise sale, you might get away with, talking to less than 20 customers, and that's a great number. But if you have a mobile or web app, you want to talk to hundreds, if not thousands, of customers. Now, obviously, you can't personally interview all those like you could in the enterprise, and so you want to get out and reach them virtually, but the number you want to get to really is an order of magnitude or two different than if you were doing B2B direct sales. Just a caveat and a warning, when you're out of the building trying to talk to hundreds or thousands of potential web or mobile app users, you want to be careful that you're not completely dependent on online surveys. People simply lie on surveys. And so what you want to have is some sample where you actually bring those people into your building or you go see them and you watch their pupils dilate as you actually ask them the question and see if that kind of diverges from the data you're getting when they're hitting your website or you're sending them questionnaires. And then you'll have a correlation to be able to figure out is that data valid or not. So just keep that in mind when you're trying to reach hundreds or thousands of people for customer discovery. Now, one other thing about the business model canvas in general, now that we've talked about customer segments, is understanding that sometimes you have multiple customers, multiple segments. And it's kind of interesting to take a look at Google as an example. So let's just take a look at Google search. Now, let's just think about, who's the customer for Google search. It's anyone searching on the web or mobile. And the product we have is a free search bar or a free mobile app. And, what are the key resources? Well, they need software and software developers and installed user base. But the key idea is this product is free. And if you think about the cost structure for this, it requires massive data centers and software development and key activities or data center scale and speed. But the key idea is the revenue model is free. But Google and Google Search is one of the most profitable businesses on the face of the earth. Well, how can Google do that? Well, think about it. What we've just been doing is Google has been acquiring users, but someone else is paying for this product. And that someone else is a different customer segment called advertisers. So we had users here, but we now have payers here. Now, what's really interesting is for every customer segment, we have a value proposition. We had a free search bar for the users, but for the advertisers, we have a completely different product. We have Google AdWords. And our customer relationships are different. For users, it was kind of an automated process. You just basically went to the Google website or you downloaded a Google toolbar. But for payers, it might be automated, but they also have telemarketing and direct sales to go after big advertisers. But their distribution channel, in addition to being automated, is also self-service and direct sales. But the key thing to note is that not only do they have different segments and different value props and different customer relationships, more importantly, they have a different revenue model. It's a big idea. Multiple customer segments require multiple value props, multiple customer relationships, sometimes different channels, but always different revenue models. These are the payers. So Google Search is what we call a two-sided market. There are users and there are payers. As we discussed, some businesses are multi-sided. In this case, let's take a look at a two-sided market and match the market with the appropriate business. So the answer is, for LinkedIn, there are two sides to this market. There are the workers as a customer segment, and there are recruiters. For Visa, you'd have banks and merchants. For eBay, you'd have sellers and buyers. And the New York Times and almost every newspaper, radio, television, Google, you have readers and you have advertisers. So understanding multi-sided markets are just understanding which customer segments in a two-sided market use and which other customer segment pays. So just to summarize, for Google Search, each had its own value proposition, but most importantly, each had its own revenue stream, and one segment cannot exist without the other. That is, if you had users but you had no revenue, you'd be out of business over time. But if you had a revenue model but no users, there would be no reason for those advertisers to show up. Now, this was an example of a two-sided market. Let's see what happens when we have multiple sides. So one last thing, and we've been avoiding bringing this up until now, but it's something you as an entrepreneur should know. It's a secret. And it's a secret that we didn't even understand for a long time. And that secret is there are 4 types of startups. And not knowing which type you are can really sink your company. So we call this market type. It turns out that there really are 4 types of markets for startups. One is an existing market. Another is where you take a segment or resegment an existing market. Another is a new market, and another is a clone market. So let's take a look why this is important, and then we'll give you the definition of each one. It turns out that the type of market changes everything. It changes your initial market size, how much it costs to enter the market, what kind of launch you do of your product. It affects the type of competitive barriers you have, and how you position or describe your product. It affects your sales model. Are you going to hire direct sales? When do you hire them? What kind of margins you should have, or the profit? How long it takes, that is the sales cycle, and something called the chasm width, which we'll take a look in a second. It also affects how much money you're going to need to raise, and how long it takes to get to profitability. And then finally, it affects the types of customers and what their needs are and how long it takes to adopt. So one of the things this looks like is just a checklist of market type seems to affect everything. What the heck can it be? So let's go a little further and define it. Existing market. Well, the customers, well, they're known. We know who they are. They exist. The customer needs, well, we could ask them, what do they really care about for gains and pains? They could tell us. Competitors, by definition, there are many. Your risk, well, your risk is lack of branding, lack of sales, lack of distribution. And unfortunately, sometimes your product really doesn't live up to the claims. Example, Google. It's an existing market. Go ahead and try to enter the search business today. There's a dominant player in search. Resegmented market. Well, you have a hypothesis about who the customers are. That is, you think you understand what your fit is, either in low cost or their specific niche needs, and so you might have a better fit for them. And competitors, there's many if you're wrong, but very few if you're right. And your risk is that you get the market and product redefinition just wrong. You didn't do enough customer discovery, and you say, no, this is how we're going to enter this existing market. We're going to go after these set of users specifically, and oops, you were wrong. A great example of this is what Southwest did. Southwest took on the airline industry by breaking up the traditional hub and spoke model and providing just very limited services, but for an extremely low price. Another is a new market, and here the customers are really unknown. All you have is a vision and a set of hypotheses. And what you're hoping is you're going to provide for customers is something transformational. Not just incremental improvement, but transformational improvement. And the good news is, and bad news, is that there are no competitors on day one. It's pretty lonely. So for this market to exist, you're going to have to create it through a force of will and a lot of money. And that's going to require evangelism and education. An example, Groupon. Right? Groupon single-handedly created the daily deals market. A clone market, the customers are possibly known because you're going to copy an existing market like the United States, but the customer needs and why it's a clone is you're going to actually localize all those specific issues for your country or region. There are no competitors if you're first, and the risk is misjudging the local needs. A great example is Baidu. So one of the interesting things about market type is that it really gives us a handle in trying to understand the expected time of profitability from shortest to longest. Take a look at the list below and rank the markets in order of expected time to profitability. So when we look at an existing market, it's clear that if you've matched those market needs, you could be achieving profitability the soonest. If you were doing a clone market, that is copying a U.S. business model in a foreign country, that probably is the second closest to immediate profitability because you know the market exists, you just need to implement it in your local country. Resegmented market, well, that's probably somewhere in between existing and clone and new because you not only have to understand the market, you have to understand the customer's specific niche or low-cost needs. But the longest time to profitability is a new market. You have a vision, you understand what the future might look like, but the market just hasn't adopted yet, and that might take years. Again, a little further definition. In an existing market, incumbents exist. Customers can name the market. Customers want or need better performance, and it's usually a technology-driven play. Positioning is driven by the product and how much value customers place on its features. The risks in an existing market is thinking that the incumbents are dumb. Typically, incumbents, unless they're large corporations that are falling asleep, will defend their turf. Remember the network effects of an incumbent. It might mean that it's not only about their product, but it might be all the ancillary services and third-party offerings they have in their catalog. And remember, just as you're focused on innovation, most incumbents are focused on innovation. So before you jump into an existing market, you need to take a look at the innovation rate of the incumbents. Now, one of the interesting things is trying to figure out what sales look like and what's the adoption rate in a new market. It turns out one of the interesting curves for startup companies is a technology lifecycle adoption curve popularized by Jeff Moore in a book called Crossing the Chasm. And Moore postulated that there was a gap, a chasm, between visionaries and the mainstream and pragmatic and conservative market. It turns out, though, in an existing market, that chasm between these early adopters and the mainstream is very small or non-existent. Because if you're right entering an existing market, your sales curve, the spreadsheet you're putting together for your revenue, if you get it correctly, should look just like this. You're taking market share from incumbents from day one. In an existing market, if customers react to your hypotheses that what they needed was higher performance, and you were correct, this is your revenue curve. Congratulations. Now the other thing is, in a resegmented market, again we use Southwest as a low-cost entrant, or Whole Foods as a unique niche supplier via positioning, what you really want to start asking is, what factors can you eliminate that your industry has long competed on, or what can you reduce below the industry standard, or raised above the industry standard, or what can be created that the industry has never offered? Now what's interesting is, if you look at the chasm between your early adopters, your early evangelists, and the mainstream market in a resegmented market, this is what Moore was kind of talking about, called the chasm. There really is a gap between what these people want and a gap between their needs. And if you're not careful, your sales curve, while it would start looking like this over here, actually might collapse until the mainstream adopts. So let's take a look at what a sales curve might look like in a resegmented market. And it's a complex sales growth chart, because in the first couple of years, you're just kind of getting the spillover of people who kind of think you're just a competitor in the existing market. And your sales will kind of tootle along until, if you're correct, and you were right about that niche or low-cost segmentation, you will start seeing an exponential increase in sales. And if you're wrong, well, you'll just kind of be one of the many competitors in an existing market. Now, the next market type is a new market. Customers don't exist today. That's the real questions are, if they don't exist, how will anybody find out about you, and how will they even become aware that they need to be in this new market? And by the way, how do you know the market size of something that doesn't even exist today? The market size is 0. And what factors should you create that the industry has never offered? Now, a way to look at this is take a look at the chasm. Man, this is scary. That is, you can sell to the crazy people all you want, the early evangelists, the early adopters, and that's nice, but you'll have a small business until you figure out, how do we get the masses to adopt? And here's what that hockey stick sales curve looks like. Here are the early people you're selling to, and one of the mistakes that startups and entrepreneurs and founders make is look at that slope of those early sales. And when you get them, you go, great, time to kick up spending, and look at this, our board's happy, and why don't we start doing advertising and staffing up the company? But then it kind of declines, and people scratch their head going, what's going on? What's going on is the mainstream market just hasn't adopted. And this might go on for years and never kick in, but if you're lucky, you'll hit a tipping point and market adoption happens. And when it happens faster than you can imagine. But at times, it takes longer to get there than you can imagine. So in a new market, one of the things you need to be thinking about is there any possible way to move this curve in? There's a couple of really interesting things to notice about a new market. One is, this valley of death of almost no sales can continue for years. Now, why is this important to know? Well, just imagine you're a startup and you've put together a nice financial forecast for your board and your investors, and they all believe that you are in an existing market. So they're expecting you to have revenue that increases every year. Why? Because you've never asked the question, what type of market am I in? Now, if you're in a new market, you now know that it's quite possible that you might have a curve that doesn't look like this, but actually is flat for a long period of time.
So the consequences of understanding a new market are essential for a startup. This was a startup killer for decades. In a new market, there are no customers, so revenues might extend out for years. In fact, if you think about what happened during the dot-com bubble in the beginning of the 21st century, is every startup executed like they were in an existing market. They hired salespeople, they spent marketing dollars in scale of tens of millions of dollars trying to create end-user demand for a market that didn't exist. Just imagine what would have happened if those startups would have parked their capital in a bank, getting interest, and doing guerrilla activities to help start the market. Because the market wasn't there. There is no way any individual startup can accelerate technology diffusion. So for a new market to take off, lots of things external to your startup need to happen. Regulation needs to change, platforms need to become cheaper, customer tastes need to change, etc. The dot-com bubble was actually predicated on all of these things happening all at once, and they didn't. And therefore, all that money that got raised got spent trying to acquire customers when there were none. The test for whether you're in a new market is not whether 30 people in your regional cluster or in Silicon Valley or New York have heard about your technology. The real test is whether your grandmother in Omaha or Berlin or in Uganda actually have heard about the technology or the product or the market. And if the market doesn't exist there, you might be spending a lot of money trying to create a market where there is none. Premature spending is the killer for startups.
So let's take a look at the last type of market. That's the clone market. This takes foreign business models and adopts it to local conditions. What's a foreign business model? Typically right now, a foreign business model is one that's occurring in the U.S. What's a local condition? Well, if your language is different than English or your culture is different than the U.S., or if your country has import restrictions or local control and ownership, and you have a market large enough to support a business model, typically countries with north of 100 million people that fit this criteria might be China, India, Russia, Brazil, even the EU itself. Just cloning U.S. business models that exist is not a bad business strategy.
Today we're going to be talking about customer relationships. In other words, how do you get, keep, and grow customers?
So in the last lecture, you remember the business model canvas, all the 9 components of a startup. We talked about value proposition, and we talked about customer segments. We talked about channels, but today we're going to focus on customer relationships. Customer relationships really is about how do you get customers, how do you keep customers, and how do you grow them. Here are 2 get, keep, and grow funnels. And the one thing to notice is the one on the top represents a physical channel, and the one on the bottom is web mobile. And the thing to just remember is a physical channel, as we're going to see later, that the details inside of how you get or acquire customers are different than how you would acquire customers in web mobile. Just know that the physical representation of the customer life cycle, get, keep, and grow, is kind of this double-barreled funnel. And that's why we draw it this way. It just allows you to kind of understand how do customers get into our company, how do we get them, how do we keep them, and how do we grow them. And so let's look at both of these, get, keep, and grow for physical and web mobile channels in a little more detail. So to recap, what are the 3 parts of customer relationships? Is it channel? Is it grow? Is it segments? Is it get? Is it partners? Or is it keep? Select the 3 that make up customer relationships. So the answers are get, keep, and grow are the 3 parts of customer relationships. As we'll see, customer relationships start with get. Get is how you actually acquire customers and get them to purchase your product. Keep, just like it sounds. How do you keep customers for a long period of time rather than losing the ones you've spent all the money acquiring? And then grow is a neat trick that smart companies do, is that they understand that it's a lot more expensive to get customers than to keep them and grow them. And so they figure out how to sell existing customers more products. Get, keep, and grow, the 3 components of customer relationships. Now, we keep using the words get, keep, and grow, but this get, keep, and grow actually refers to human beings, not just random ideas. And one of the things we need to understand is what's the archetype or the persona of our customers that we're actually wanting to get. And so one of the things that's kind of hard for startups is to realize that getting customers isn't some abstract idea. You really need to understand who your customers are. And this is not just thinking about selling to consumers, even in corporations, there are human beings with titles that you need to figure out almost the same things as you would in a consumer company. And so what you need to understand, what are the roles of these individuals you're trying to sell to? Who are they? If it's in a company, what's their position? What's their title? What's their organization? And by the way, not just on the org chart, how do they get influenced, or who do they influence? And if they're actually buyers, how do they buy? I mean, how do they hear about products? How do they know about you? And as we'll see later, one of the interesting things is there are some customers that are users, like in Google, there are people who use search, but there are people who are payers, who are actually a whole different customer segment. So you need to understand, are these people, this archetype I'm trying to define, are they the users, are they payers, are they regulators, or are they somewhere else in the buying process? And what you really are trying to understand, if you remember from the value proposition and customer segment lectures, is you're trying to understand what pain is being solved for them and what gain is your product creating for them. And at the core is you're trying to derive an archetype of who they are. And so what we tend to do is suggest there are startups that you literally start with a series of hypotheses, and you get out of the building, and in your customer discovery process, you're going to start refining archetypes. Turns out that most companies are selling to multiple archetypes. If you have 2 or 3, don't worry, that's probably fine. If you have 20, it means you voted none of the above, and you really need to refine it more. But then we suggest that companies actually pick a representative picture of who that persona is, who the person would most represent that archetype, put together a poster, post it on the wall of your engineering department, and say, here's who you're building the product for. It's Dave. He might be young urban professional, 21 to 30, lives in large cities, buys X or Y. Or it could be Sally, Midwest mother, 45 to 55 in the Midwest of the United States. Or someone in India or China. It doesn't matter. What you need to do is have an opinion based on some fact that gets refined, that helps you understand these are the people we're trying to acquire. And don't angst about your first hypothesis, but understand the whole goal of customer discovery is to continually to refine. These are the people we think are most likely to buy in the early stages of our company. So once I understand who my archetypes or persona is, the next thing I want to figure out is how do I get them into this funnel? Regardless of whether it's web or mobile, I need to somehow figure out how to get the interests of my customer archetypes, Dave in major urban area, or Sally in the Midwest, or someone in China or India. How do I get them interested? And there are 2 types of ways to create demand. The first set of things are paid demand creation activities. Fancy word for saying, I'm going to pay somebody to get your interest. First people I might want to pay is a public relations agency. I might pay them a certain fee per month to help get stories about my products appear and or my company in newspapers or on blogs or in tech journals, etc. And so hiring a PR agency is a paid demand creation activity. Another common paid activity is advertising. What kind of advertising? Well, it depends what my archetype reads. If they read a blog, I want to somehow get either keywords or banner ads or something on the blog. If they read newspapers or tech journals or listen to radio or television, that is, I want to match my demand creation activities to what I know about my archetype. I'm not just going to randomly do this. I'm actually going to try to match what I know to what I'm going to pay for. Next thing could be trade shows. In some industries, people still physically go to trade shows, have booths, walk the aisles, meet people. Maybe I should be at one and have a booth. And maybe I'll find out my archetypes don't even care. And by the way, just as an aside, you might also want to be worried about where do your partners show up. Maybe they show up at trade shows. The other thing is I might find out instead of trade shows and or webinars might be interesting. Or I just might want to be sending them email or direct mail. The U.S. Post Office or post offices in other countries are still happy to carry your advertising, though these become less and less effective the more and more people are on the web. And then finally, search engine marketing, Google AdWords, Facebook ads, etc., are now just a standard way to pay for demand creation activities regardless of whether it's a physical channel or a mobile channel. All of these activities are designed to feed the sales funnel. That demand creation funnel is going to be fed by these things you do. So unlike paid demand creation activities, earned demand creation activities is just another word for the types of demand creation activities we get for free. These might be publications in journals. They might be conferences you get to speak at, speeches you give elsewhere, maybe blogs you put on your blog, Or you might be invited to do guest blogs elsewhere, or guest articles. Or, most importantly, it might be social media. You might have a company Facebook page, you might tweet, people in your company might tweet, anything you could do for free that gets you attention of the key customer archetypes and helps drive them into your acquisition activities. And let's just take a look again at those activities. If you remember, what we're trying to do is get, keep, and grow customers. And so these things on the left, with all these arrows going into the funnel, those represent all the demand creation activities you were doing, either paid or free. And in a physical channel, they were getting you into the funnel on the top. And for web, mobile, or cloud, they were getting you into the funnel on the bottom. And remember, these are just visual representations of a process. The world doesn't actually look like this, but when you get good enough at this, you tend to actually look at your process literally looking as a funnel laying on its side, and you tend to think about how do we efficiently get payers or users into the funnel and all the way through. Let's take a look at a customer acquisition process that reaches 100 people a day and activates 10%. How many customers will you have after 2 days, and how many will you have after a week? The answer is simple math. After 2 days, you'll have activated 20 customers. After 7 days, you'll activate 70. So let's take a look at getting customers for a physical channel. So what does that mean? So imagine you're JetBlue, and you now have a new airline route going from LaGuardia in the United States in New York City down to Florida, Orlando. And you really want to get people to know about this new airline route. Well, the first thing you're going to use is earned and paid media. You might run TV ads, you might run radio spots, newspapers, your website, you might send out email. And the first thing you're doing with this paid media is you're trying to get people aware that you even have a flight from New York to Orlando. And so this first step in a physical channel is generating awareness. People just need to know that this thing exists. Now, the bad news is that your ad agencies and whatever could tell you how many people this ad will reach, but they can't quite tell you yet how many will purchase. But you're interested in, okay, did they hear this? The next thing that you might want is to know, are they interested? Nowadays, even in physical channels, we could see it. Did anybody hit the JetBlue website, and did they push the button on fares from Orlando and New York to Orlando? Is there some interest, or did they call your 1-800 number? But really, where it finally gets engaging in a physical channel is, are people actually asking for the schedules and are hitting the how much does it cost page? And in fact, what you really want to be tracking is, are people calling reservations, or if this was a car dealership, are they showing up in the dealer, taking the car out for a test drive? That's consideration. And in a physical channel, it's really interesting to measure the difference between how many people did my ads or free media reach versus how many did I get into my physical channel to actually consider the product. How many showed up in the store? How many showed up on my website? How many called the 800 number? And it's this space between actually doing, and this is what makes it so hard in physical channels, is all the effort on paid and earned media. You really don't know where those customers are until they're physically inside your channel considering the purchase. And then, of course, when they click, I'll buy it, or tell a dealer, I'll take the car, or in JetBlue's case, actually say, I'll buy this fare or book this seat, do you finally understand whether you have the order or not? And that's what acquisition looks like in a physical channel. Awareness, consideration, and purchase. Now, in a world where basically that's all you do is you create demand on the left side of the funnel and somebody purchases on the right, you could kind of like measure how much it costs to do that. And we'll talk about customer acquisition cost a little later, but there's a little magic accelerator on the bottom of these funnels. And that's called the viral loop. And a viral loop could be something as simple as somebody bought one of your products in the store and could not wait to tell their friends. Wow, this was the greatest thing ever. You can't wait to get in. Boom. You now have kind of a magnifying effect, a viral effect about selling your product based on users loving it. That's happened for hundreds of years. But now we could sometimes engineer this viral loop by saying, is there anything we can do? Any incentives? Any ways to kind of give rebates? Is there a way to turn our customers into salespeople to kind of accelerate this purchase to help us get new customers? And smart startups think about this loop all the time. So viral loops are something that startups want to see if it's possible to create. Now, just don't feel bad if in your company it's really not possible to do viral. For example, in dating sites. Not everybody wants to announce to their friends that they're actually visiting a dating site. So in some cases, it might not be possible. But in others, you should always keep your eye out. Is it possible to make this funnel more efficient? Just as a note, one of the interesting things about getting customers is I happen to draw the funnel that says awareness, interest, consideration, and purchase. But here's just a heads up. In your funnel, in your physical channel, you might decide the steps are slightly different. So don't feel locked in to calling them awareness, interest, consideration, and purchase. Just realize that you need to modify this to what your real cycle is. And you will only kind of learn that as you watch customers get from being aware of your product to purchase. So use this as a template, but don't think that there's anything magic about this. It's just a proxy. We've just been talking about getting customers in a physical channel, but what's really interesting is most startups kind of forget that it's much more expensive to get a customer than it is to keep one. Yet we seem to go from order to order or user to user, forgetting about thinking about over time is how can we extract more dollars or usage or whatever's important to us from our existing customers. How we do that is the first thing we need to do is make sure our existing customers we've just gotten don't go away. And so if you're in business long enough, you start thinking about how to keep customers. Some examples? Well, the airlines are the perfect examples of keeping customers. They run something called the loyalty programs. They give you points, they give you rewards, etc. for staying with their airline. Credit card companies. Boy, they love to keep you using their credit card because, you know what, it's just a piece of plastic and they're loaning you money. Anybody could do that, but they want your business full time. So they'll make up programs and, things that make you think about, oh, it would be terrible to leave this credit card to this airline because I lose all the points. That's a great example of a loyalty program. Or product updates. Here's a way to keep me loyal is instead of just this one-time purchase, I'm getting these updates or newsletters or something useful through the lifetime of the product. And smart companies who not only do loyalty and product updates, sometimes just send me newsletters and here's what's going on and here's whatever and how can we help you, etc. Even though on day one you're not thinking about keeping customers because you're desperately worried about getting them, just understand the next thing you're going to be doing is worrying about how to keep your most valuable customers. So the next step in this funnel is, remember, we just talked about getting customers, and let's talk about keeping customers. This is what I call the you should be so lucky to have this problem part of the funnel. And that's how you grow the customers you have. If you think about growing customers, nothing magic, you've now sold these customers way back here under purchase. And you've kept them around with loyalty programs and product updates. But really what you'd like to do, understanding now that it's a lot cheaper to sell existing customers more stuff than it is to get new customers, is let's go try to sell them some stuff. And how can we do that? Well, the first thing you might want to think about is, can I unbundle some of the stuff in my startup that I try to package all at once? One of the mistakes that early stage ventures make, that is new companies, is thinking that you have to stick every possible feature in the product and sell it for the one price. It might be possible once you understand more and more about your customers to know that, you know what, most people just kind of want the base product. Or you might have a freemium strategy, which just says, I'll give them the base product for free, but really understanding that what they're going to want, some percentage, is these other things. Unbundling is just a fancy word for saying, can I somehow decompose the product into separate pieces, giving some for free, or if you're lucky, charging for every one of them. I used to do this all the time to actually increase the average selling price by unbundling the product. The next thing to think about is, can I upsell the product? A retailer in the United States called Sears had a line of tools that they sold to people who made things, and their product line always had three types of products: good, better, and best. And what they would try to get you to do is get you into the store looking at the price of the good product, but then when you got there you said, well, I deserve better, and then someday I could aspire to the best. And so that was kind of upselling in the same product line. And in fact, in the United States, from the 1920s to the 1960s, the master of upselling was General Motors. When they had separate brands, each at a fixed price point. You started buying a car with a Chevrolet, then you moved up to a Buick, then a Pontiac, then a Oldsmobile, then eventually you could aspire to a Cadillac. And these were all kind of upselling based on aspirations. And the quality and features of the products increased as well. You might want to think about creating an upsell strategy. Cross-sell, well, that's also kind of simple. Gee, if you're buying one product, are there any accessories or companion products that you ought to just figure out to make sure that your customers are aware of? Or on the pricing page or on a price list say, gee, when you buy this product, we'll give you a 20% discount off of this other one, which most consumers would realize, ooh, I'd like to have that too. And so thinking about what adjacent products, what products next to the one you're already selling customers can buy is a cross-selling strategy. Finally, the last piece is referrals, and that's another growth strategy. And referrals basically generates this outer viral loop. Remember what we were trying to do in the initial purchase, or get your new customers to start telling their friends about your products. You want to do the same thing after you've had those customers for a while. Maybe now you want to give them discounts on future purchases. You want to say thank you for doing this. By the way, $100 off or $5 off of the next purchase. When you bring in the next new customers, banks now think that's a popular strategy. And this referral program just helps your customers, hopefully who are satisfied, sell more of your product for you. And so that's get, keep, and now grow customers. By the way, this grow funnel, just like in get customers, there's nothing magic about cross-sell, upsell, and unbundling. There might be other strategies that your company and your startup might want to stick into this funnel as well. We put this up as kind of a canonical model because most companies tend to use these types of techniques, but it really depends on what your industry and product line is. So let's take a look at now the web mobile funnel. Now, what's really interesting is in the web mobile funnel, the getting customers part of the funnel is actually quite simple, at least on first glance. We still have earned and paid media driving customers into the funnel. If you remember, we understood who the customer archetype was. We're running search engine marketing or search engine optimization. But in the web, we just really have to do two things. First one is we got to acquire customers, and then we activate them. Well, what's acquire mean? Acquire on the web is I want to get them to my site, or to my mobile app, or to my cloud app. How do I do that? As we said, earned and paid media will drive customers somehow to be looking at a place that you're at. But the next step is much harder. After I acquire them, I want them to do something. I just don't want them to look and go away. I want them to either pay for the product, or sign up for something, or become a user. That is, the word activate means I want you to engage with my website or my app and do something I have planned for you to do. Now, in the simple world, is what I would plan for you to do is open your wallet and give me all your money. In a non-perfect world, you might just be a user, and I'm going to monetize you by getting payers to pay for the fact that I have lots of users. But acquisition, that is acquire, and activation is a two-part strategy. So in theory, understanding acquisition and activation seems pretty simple. I get it. I understand who my customers are, and then I figure out what earned and paid media I want to use. And on the web, that might be paying Google for AdWords, and I want to acquire them, and I want to activate them. How hard could this be? Well, it actually gets kind of fun, because the real metric, the way we kind of measure things, the language we use on the web, is customer acquisition cost. And what we want to do is figure out how much is it really going to cost us to get an activated customer out here on the right hand of the get funnel. So let's kind of do an exercise and see what it feels like and how does it work to get an activated customer and how much it costs. So let's assume I'm using Google AdWords and I'm paying 50 cents for pay per click. And let's assume my campaign at 50 cents each gets me 10,000 people to come look at my website. Well, 50 cents times 10,000, that cost me $5,000. But the goal isn't to just have people visit. The goal is to get them to the end of the funnel And at the end of the funnel, I want them to actually have paid for and or used the product. So the goal is to activate them. Now what's interesting is assume I'm offering a trial, and assume that maybe just 5% of the people who I've acquired actually now take the trial. And so I now have 500 people using my freemium product. But the goal is not to just have them use a freemium product. The goal is to actually have them pay for it. And what's interesting is assume 10% of those now actually pay. So I'd start with 10,000 people who came to my site. I spent $5,000 for them. 500 people took a trial of the product, and 50, only 50, actually paid for the full version of the product. So while 10,000 people look great for $5,000 because it only cost me 50 cents per person, if we now do the math, we can now see it cost me $100 to acquire one paying customer. That $100 equals my customer acquisition cost. I used this example for a web mobile channel, but it's similar for a physical channel. You might not be doing pay-per-click, you might be doing direct mail math, or you might be doing television or radio math, but the math works the same. How much did it cost to acquire a customer? How much did the campaign cost? How much did it cost to get them to consider your product? How much did it cost them to take a test drive of your car or fly your airline? And what, in the end, was your customer acquisition cost? That's a key number for any founder thinking about a startup. So now we're going to do a quiz. And what we're going to do is try to calculate how much it costs to actually get an active customer. And let's start with the pay-per-click. Let's assume we're doing a web company, and we spend 75 cents on Google AdWords for every click that comes to our website here. Now assume we actually have figured out how to acquire 4,025 customers at 75 cents in this campaign. Next, we just don't want to get them to our website. We actually wanted them to sign up for our product. Assume 3.7% of these 4,025 customers actually converted from acquired customers to activated customers. So the question for this quiz is calculate what was the customer acquisition cost per customer. So let's see how we came up with our answer. So number one, our pay-per-click number was 75 cents for each customer that we got to our site. And we know we got 4,025 customers. And so if we multiply that out, we know we've spent $3,018. And the next number that's important is that not all 4,025 actually activated. And in fact, if we look at this number, our conversion number, only 3.7% converted. And so if we multiply that out, we'll discover that equals about 149 activated customers. And now, if we divide the $3,018 by these 149 activated customers, we find out that the customer acquisition cost, the CAC, equals about $20. More precisely, about $20.27. So let's take a look at keeping customers for the web mobile channel. So web mobile works almost exactly like physical channels, keeping customers. It's exactly the same idea. You might want to offer loyalty programs, contests and events, blogs, RSS, and email, or social media, all designed to engage customers. What you want to think about keeping customers is that customers are a lot more expensive to acquire over here than they are to keep. And the key thing that you want to worry about is churn, or sometimes called customer attrition. And here's why. So imagine if you were losing 5% of your customers a month. Well, in 3 years, you'd only have about 16% of them left. But imagine if you could reduce churn to 1%, so that every month only 1% of these customers left. So after 36 months, with 1% attrition, you'd have 70% of your customers left. Just think about it. With 5% attrition, your average customer sticks around for about 20 months, but with 1% attrition, they stick around for 100 months. You get 5 times more revenue from the same customers by just working on keeping these customers around. Now, by the way, in reality, financial people discount the cash flows from customers later in this life cycle, so the actual value you get is somewhat less. How much less depends on your industry and cost of capital, but we'll leave that for the accountants in a more detailed class. So this last step is growing customers for the web mobile channels. Now, if you remember, we started here on the left. We did earned and paid media. We got customers, acquired them, and activated them. We've kept them, trying to keep churn to a minimum. And now we're going to grow customers with a series of activities, just like in the physical channel. Can we upsell? Can we next sell? Can we cross-sell? And we can get referrals that will get us a viral loop. One of the most important metrics to think about now that we have an end-to-end funnel is something called lifetime value. And lifetime value, LTV, is not your lifetime, but your customer's lifetime. How much will they spend with you and your company from the beginning to the very end? And this is kind of an interesting idea because most startups and most founders are focused on how do I get them to activate here? But for you to be a successful company and actually thinking about how much you could spend on them over here, you need to understand, can I get them to spend more and more over time, and how to keep them longer and longer by reducing churn? So one of the interesting equations for every startup is that lifetime value needs to be greater than customer acquisition cost. Seems intuitively obvious, but what you want to make sure is the amount of money you're collecting over here is bigger than the customer acquisition cost. You remember the amount of money you were spending from here to here. That was the customer acquisition cost, CAC, here. So lifetime value needs to be greater than customer acquisition cost. And as you get more familiar with your company and start talking to investors, the real interesting thing is, what is this ratio? For example, in SaaS software, some investors think that number should be 3 to 1. In telecom, it might be something else. But the key idea is you are now not just focused on the initial purchase, but you're focused on the lifetime value. If you have the world's most perfect business model, investors would love to see this number much bigger than this number. And so what you want to look for is a well-balanced model that takes into account how much you need to acquire customers, but how much ultimately you will extract from them over the lifetime. What's the lifetime? That really is up to you and your investors and how many years you calculate lifetime value. Some use 3 years, some use 5. That's a question that you and your investors will discuss. This acquisition cost versus lifetime value discussion really is a balancing act. So what are some of the balancing acts? Well, in the customer acquisition cost, if all of a sudden you could get a viral loop going, well, that decreases your cost of acquisition. If in fact your conversion rate between acquisition and activation could be increased, again, it decreases your customer acquisition cost. If you could do in physical channels telesales or inside sales versus having a direct sales force, again, your CAC declines. The idea is, what can you do to make this very efficient? And therefore also on lifetime value. How do you reduce churn and attrition in keeping customers? Do you have scalable pricing? Are you cross-selling and upselling a lot? Can you expand your product line? And again, are you getting a viral loop and referral loop from happy and satisfied customers telling others word of mouth? And so this is a balancing game. And for first-time entrepreneurs who are focused here, it's really important to think about customer acquisition cost and lifetime value. So the question is, what is lifetime value? Is it the sum of all get activities? Reducing churn? All of the grow revenue? Or is it the total customer revenue through get, keep, grow? So customer lifetime value is exactly what it sounds like. What's the sum of all the revenue from day one purchase through keeping them, through all the grow activities you'll undertake? So lifetime value is the customer lifetime value from beginning to end. And just as a note, remember, customer acquisition costs, the part over here, needs to be less than customer lifetime value. That's how you stay in business and become a valuable company.